Hey guys, last of the reviews. This one is for Pythagoras, or as we sometimes call it, sum of squares, because math teachers like messing with you guys by giving the same thing different names. So, it has to do with right angle triangles. This only works for a right angle triangle. So right angle means you've got an angle of 90 degrees. The way we show you that there's an angle of 90 degrees is we put a little square in the diagram on one of the angles. So a right angle triangle is a triangle with a right angle in it. Now, the longest side of a right angle triangle, one side will always be longer than the other two, and we call that the hypotenuse because math teachers have to give a fancy name to things to confuse people. We can't just call it the longest side. The longest side, the way you find it, that's going to be your side C. It's always exactly opposite the right angle, all right? So if you look for the square, look across from the square, that'll always be your hypotenuse, and you'll never mess it up. The rule for right angle triangles is called the sum of squares or Pythagorean theorem. Again, why do we give it two names? I think mathematicians are just mean. And if they actually said things in English, it would be too easy and we wouldn't think they were smart. Now, Pythagoras theorem, or the sum of squares, says if you make a square out of the length of the sides of a right angle triangle, the area of the biggest square will equal the area of the other two squares added together. Now, remember, we find area by length times width, or basically for a square, length times length, which is the equivalent of squaring it. That's why we call it squaring it, is that you're basically multiplying the side by itself. Mathematically, it looks like this, the Pythagorean theorem. Again, this is the exact same thing as what I said above, that the square of side C is the same as the square of side A plus the square of side B. Now, the only thing to remember is C is always the hypotenuse, the one opposite. That's the only one you have to get right. The other two are just called legs, and it doesn't matter which one you call A or which one you call B, you'll get exactly the same answer. So, just remember though, math uses both sum of squares and Pythagoras to mean the same thing. So if you ever see someone say sum of squares, it just means you're using the Pythagorean theorem. So it says Pythagorean theorem, it means you're using sum of squares. It's literally two words for the exact same thing. So what do we do with it? Well, we use it to solve for the sides. And there's only two questions I can ask you. In fact, that's one of the tricks you're going to learn from math. There's a limited number of questions I can ask you. I can only ask you two questions with Pythagorean theorem. I can ask you to solve for the hypotenuse, the longest side, or I can ask you to solve for one of the other two sides. And if you know the steps to solve it, the trick with problem solving is you need to know the steps. You don't know the answer right away, like you would on a biology test where, we say photosynthesis and you tell me what that is. Math, you need to know the steps. So the steps to solve for the hypotenuse are, first step, write out the equation. A squared plus b squared is equal to c squared, or c squared equals a squared plus b squared is the normal way to write it. Identify the hypotenuse. Figure out what the longest side is. Well, that's this side. Plug that in okay, that's the side you're trying to solve for. So, plug in the length of the other two sides, say 3 and 4 for example, square them, add the numbers together, take a square root, you're done. So the whole trick to doing this is don't think about it. Literally, just write out the equation, figure out what the longest side is, plug in the number for the other two, square them, add them, take the square root. You got an answer. The whole trick to math is when you start doing it step by step, it becomes easy because you're not even thinking about it. You're just saying, oh, I know how to do this. I follow steps A, B, C, D, boom, answer, good, move on. The only other question I could ask you is how do you solve for a side that isn't the hypotenuse? Now, the nice thing is, because it doesn't matter what A and B is, let's just always call the side you're solving for A. Step 1, write the equation. C squared equals A squared plus B squared. Step 2, rewrite it as A squared equals C squared minus B squared. Or you could just write this equation first, that A squared is C squared minus B squared. Identify the hypotenuse. That's the longest side. Make sure you plug that number in for your C. That's the only way you can get this wrong. Then plug the other number in for your B, square them, subtract them, take a square root, and you got your answer. So again, it's exactly the same thing. So if I ask you to find a side that's not the hypotenuse, you're going to notice that because you'll have a number beside the across from the square. Write a squared equals c squared minus b squared. Write the hypotenuse in, write the other number in, square them, subtract them, square root, answer. If you remember these steps, you'll never actually get it wrong. The other thing to remember is you can actually have this PowerPoint up when you're writing tests for me now that we're online, and I'll never know. Just, pointing that out. All right. Have a good day, folks.